They called him the quietest man in the territory, though no one knew his real story. Bob lived on the edge of Dry Creek, where the land flattened into dust and sky, and words were usually the only things that kept a man company. He had arrived 5 years earlier, with a mule, a weathered Bible, and a vow he never explained. From that day on, he did not speak. People tried at first. The shopkeeper asked his name. Bob wrote it on a scrap of paper. The sheriff asked if he was running from something. Bob shook his head once. The preacher asked if the silence was punishment or penance. Bob simply lowered his eyes. Eventually, the questions stopped. In a land loud with gunshots, barroom laughter, and arguments over fence lines, silence made a man strange and a little frightening. Bob built his cabin himself, every nail driven with patience. He traded labor for supplies, fixing roofs, digging wells, mending fences. He listened carefully when spoken to, nodding or writing short replies. He never drank, never gambled, never stayed long where voices grew sharp. Folks learned to speak softer around him, as if noise might bruise something fragile inside. Antonia arrived in Dry Creek on a hot afternoon, stepping off the stagecoach with a suitcase full of wire spools and words she couldn't keep inside. She was the new telegraph operator, sent by the rail company to replace a man who drank himself into uselessness. She talked as she walked, thanking the driver, greeting strangers, narrating the heat, the dust, the smell of horses. Her voice seemed to trail behind her like music. The telegraph office sat beside the station, its windows open to catch any breeze. Antonia filled the space with life immediately humming while she worked, chatting with customers, scolding the key when it stuck. She learned names quickly and repeated them often, afraid silence might swallow her whole if she let it. The first time she saw Bob, he stood outside the office, holding a crate of firewood, waiting patiently while she finished sending a message. She noticed him because he didn't interrupt. Everyone else always did. "You can set it there," she said, pointing, then added, "unless you prefer the shade." "Which I understand completely, because this sun feels personal." Bob smiled faintly and set the crate down where she asked. She kept talking about the heat, about the wire humming strangely, about how Dry Creek felt like a place that had forgotten how to rest. Bob listened, really listened, his eyes steady and kind. When she finally paused, expecting a reply, he reached into his pocket and handed her a folded note. "Bob," it read, "I don't speak." Antonia blinked, then laughed softly, not unkindly. "Well," she said, "that's all right. I speak enough for the both of us." Bob's smile widened, just a little. From that day on, he came by often with small deliveries or errands that didn't require words. Antonia talked, Bob listened, and something unspoken, something patient and slow began to take shape between them, like a message tapping its way through a wire, waiting to be understood. Antonia learned quickly that Dry Creek had its own rhythm, one that didn't care for hurry. Messages came in bursts: rail schedules, cattle prices, news of births and deaths, then long stretches of nothing but wind brushing against the building. During those quiet hours, she talked anyway. She talked to the walls, the telegraph key, the dust motes drifting through sunlight. And, more often than not, she talked to Bob. He began stopping by in the late afternoons, usually with some small excuse: a loose board on the platform, a delivery for the station master, a fence post that needed moving. Antonia suspected the excuses were thin, but she didn't mind. She liked the way he leaned against the doorframe and listened, as if every word mattered. "People think telegraph work is all clicking and codes," she said one day, tapping the key lightly. "But it's really about waiting, listening for something to come through. Funny, isn't it?" Bob nodded. His hands rested loosely at his sides, scarred from work, steady as the ground beneath them. She noticed then how quiet he truly was, not just in speech, but in movement. He never fidgeted, never rushed her. When she spoke, he didn't interrupt, or glance away. It was unsettling at first, like being seen too clearly. Others noticed, too. "You best be careful with that one," the station master warned her. "A man who don't talk's got something to hide." Antonia frowned. Or maybe he's already said everything he needed to. The rumors followed Bob like dust. Some said he'd killed a man. Others claimed he'd lost his voice in a fire, or that God had taken his words as punishment. Antonia never asked. Instead, she listened to his silences, his careful notes, the way his eyes softened when she laughed. One evening, a storm rolled in fast and angry. The telegraph wire sang under the wind, messages piling up faster than Antonia could send them out. Sweat dampened her collar as she worked, fingers flying. Bob stayed. When lightning cracked close enough to rattle the windows, she jumped. Without thinking, she reached out. Bob's hand was already there, steady and warm, grounding her like an anchor. He didn't pull away right away. Neither did she. After the storm passed, the quiet felt heavier than before. "I don't mind silence," Antonia said softly. "I just never had much of it growing up. My house was loud, always arguing or singing or crying. Silence felt like something bad was about to happen." Bob listened, then wrote slowly on his paper. "Silence can be a place to rest." She read it twice. That's a beautiful way to put it," she said. "Did you always feel that way?" He hesitated, then shook his head. A few days later, trouble came to town, riding on whiskey and pride. A cattleman, drunk and angry, cornered Bob outside the saloon, shouting accusations that didn't matter anymore. The crowd watched, waiting for Bob to defend himself. He didn't. He stood still, eyes calm, absorbing the words without flinching. Antonia pushed through the crowd. "Leave him be," she said sharply. "He's done nothing to you." The man sneered. "What's he gonna do? Tell me off." Bob met Antonia's gaze. For a moment, she wondered if he might break his vow. Instead, he gently took her arm and led her away, choosing peace over pride. That night, Antonia couldn't sleep. She realized something then, lying awake with the wind whispering through Dry Creek. Bob's silence wasn't emptiness. It was a choice. And for the first time in her life, Antonia wondered what might happen if she learned to listen as well as she spoke. Dry Creek changed with the seasons, though it never announced the change aloud. Summer burned itself out into cooler nights, and Antonia began wearing a shawl in the evenings. Bob noticed before she did. One afternoon, she found a neatly folded blanket resting on the chair in the telegraph office. No note, no explanation. Just the quiet kindness she was coming to recognize as his language. She smiled at it, longer than necessary. Their companionship settled into something gentle and constant. Bob repaired the line poles beyond town, and Antonia walked with him when her duties allowed, talking while he worked. She told him about her childhood in St. Louis, her mother's habit of filling silence with prayers, her father's way of leaving rooms without closing doors. "I think that's why I talk," she admitted once. "If I keep making noise, nothing can leave without me noticing." Bob paused in his work. He wrote carefully. "Some things leave even when we're watching." The truth of it stung, but she nodded. It was weeks later, as autumn crept in, that Antonia finally learned the shape of Bob's past. They were sitting outside his cabin, the sky wide and bruised with dusk. Antonia had talked herself tired, her words trailing off into the sound of crickets. Bob stared toward the hills, distant and thoughtful. Then he stood, went inside, and returned with a small tin box. He opened it and handed her a folded letter. It was old, the ink faded. A woman's handwriting. She read slowly. "If you had spoken, maybe I would have stayed. If you had said you were afraid, I would have understood." Antonia looked up, her throat tight. Bob wrote beneath it, his hand unsteady. "I spoke when it mattered most. I spoke in anger. My brother died because of it." The story came in fragments. After that, written words, long pauses, breaths taken and released. A fight. A gun drawn too quickly. A shout meant to stop, not provoke. Silence afterward, so complete, it swallowed everything else. Bob had taken his vow not because he hated words, but because he feared them. Antonia reached for his hand, holding it without speaking. For once, she knew better than to fill the space. From that night on, something shifted. Antonia began noticing how often she spoke, to avoid feeling, how she rushed through quiet moments instead of living inside them. She started pausing before answering, listening not just to Bob, but to herself. One afternoon, a message came through that made her hands shake. The rail company planned to reroute the telegraph line. Dry Creek's office would be closed within months. She wanted to cry, to rage, to talk it to death. Instead, she walked to Bob's cabin and sat beside him in silence, letting the truth settle between them. Bob watched her carefully. Then he wrote, "You don't have to decide anything tonight." She exhaled, surprised by the relief of it. As winter approached, Antonia found herself speaking less sound, meaning more when she did. Bob, in turn, began writing longer notes, sometimes leaving them where she'd find them unexpectedly, under her telegraph key, tucked into her coat pocket, pressed into her palm before he left. They were learning each other's languages, but Dry Creek was not a place that allowed peace without challenge. Change was coming down the wire, and silence once chosen would soon be tested. Winter arrived without ceremony, frosting Dry Creek in pale mornings and long nights. The telegraph wires stiffened in the cold, carrying messages that felt heavier than orders, closures, goodbyes. Antonia read them all, her face carefully composed. But Bob could see the strain in her shoulders, the way her hands lingered on the key after each transmission. The news of the office's closure spread fast. Some folks shrugged, others cursed the rail company. A few came to Antonia with pity in their eyes, already speaking of her in the past tense. "You'll be leaving us soon," they said, as if it were settled. Antonia smiled and nodded, but said little. She spent more evenings at Bob's cabin, where the fire cracked softly and the world felt smaller, safer. Sometimes she talked, sometimes she didn't. Bob never pressed her either way. Silence, she was learning, could be shared without being lonely. One night, she finally said it. "They want me in Junction City. Bigger office, better pay." Her voice wavered. "It's what I've always worked toward." Bob stared into the fire. The flames reflected in his eyes, restless. She continued, softer now, "But every time I think about leaving, it feels like I'm cutting something loose that I just learned how to hold." Bob picked up his notebook. His pencil hovered, then stopped. He set it aside. He did not write. Instead, he stood and stepped outside, into the cold. Antonia followed, confusion tightening her chest. The moon hung low, washing the snow in silver. Bob faced her, hands clenched at his sides, breath visible in short bursts. She realized then what was happening. Her heart began to pound. Bob opened his mouth. No sound came at first. He swallowed hard, as if forcing his way through something thick and painful. "Antonia," he said. The sound of his voice, rough, unused, trembling, hit her harder than any shout could have. Tears sprang to her eyes instantly. "I don't know how to live in a world where you leave," he continued, each word costing him something. "But I won't ask you to stay if it turns me into the man I was." She stepped closer, shaking. "Bob, you don't have to." "I need to say it," he interrupted gently. "I love you, and I am afraid." The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was charged, alive. Antonia took his face in her hands. "Thank you for trusting me with your voice," she whispered. "But listen to me now." She drew a breath, grounding herself the way he had taught her. "I don't want to run toward noise anymore," she said. "I want to choose what matters, and you matter." Bob's eyes filled. He nodded once, unable to speak again. Maybe he had only a few words in him. Maybe that was enough. The next morning, Antonia sent her reply down the wire. She declined the offer. Dry Creek's office would close, yes, but she would not leave just yet. There were other ways to listen, other ways to stay connected. She and Bob would find them together. As the sun rose over the frozen land, Antonia realized something profound. Silence was no longer something to fear. It was something to protect. And in that quiet understanding, their future uncertain, but chosen, began to take shape. Spring returned to Dry Creek, the way it always had, slowly, cautiously, as if testing whether the land still remembered how to bloom. The telegraph office stood quieter now, its days numbered, but Antonia no longer filled the silence with nervous chatter. She sent fewer messages, lingered longer between them, listening to the space around her. Bob still spoke rarely. The words he had given her that winter night seemed to have taken all the force from him, leaving his voice tender and fragile. Antonia never asked him to use it again. Some vows, she understood now, were not broken, only softened. When the office finally closed, the town gathered, without much ceremony. There were handshakes, brief thanks, and the familiar ache of endings that didn't announce themselves as important until they were already past. Antonia locked the door one last time, resting her palm against the wood as if it might speak back. Bob waited for her outside. They walked together, toward his cabin, toward the life they had quietly been building. Antonia began teaching children their letters in the mornings, turning the old station into a school of sorts. Bob expanded his land, planting crops instead of fences, learning patience in a different form. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, watching the sky stretch endlessly. Sometimes Antonia talked stories, memories, questions. Sometimes she didn't. When words came, they were chosen carefully. When silence came, it was welcomed. Bob wrote less now. He didn't need to explain himself the way he once had. Antonia listened with her whole body, the way he had always listened to her. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Bob reached for her hand and spoke again only once. "Stay." Antonia smiled, squeezing his fingers. "I already have." The wind moved through the grass, carrying nothing urgent, nothing loud, just the sound of a place at rest. And in the quiet that remained, they found not absence, but understanding, love, and a future built not on how much was said, but on how deeply it was heard. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more Western stories.